about DevOps and cloud technologies. So by the end of this, hopefully you'll walk away with a better understanding of how to approach API design and, well, a starting point for learning about all the cool tools that you can use to actually build and deploy these things.
Sounds like we're building bridges between applications.
Perfect analogy. Okay, so let's jump right in. This first source, it really emphasizes that API design should be treated like a clear conversation.
Right.
You know, you need consistent naming if you want people to understand what's going on. And there's this example they give, users versus get users. They seem to do the same thing, but users is just cleaner. It fits better with RESTful principles, where you're treating data like resources.
Makes sense. It's like when you're talking to someone, you wouldn't start every sentence with a verb, right? It just wouldn't sound natural.
Exactly. So why do it in your API? Another thing that really stood out to me was the emphasis on using those standard HTTP status codes, the ones we all know and love. 404 not found, 500 for server errors.
Oh, yeah. They're not just for debugging. They actually help you build trust because they provide consistent feedback.
Right. Like if my request goes through, I get that nice 200. Okay. But if I mess up and try to access something that doesn't exist, boom, 404 tells me right away what's going on.
Exactly. Those codes, they're like a shared language between your API and the developers using it. So important for building robust and reliable applications.
Okay, so moving on to URL structure. The source recommends grouping related resources logically instead of just scattering endpoints randomly.
So something like users' posts, for example.
Yeah. Not only does it look neater, but it makes your API way easier to scale and adapt down the line. Like, let's say later on you want users to comment on those posts.
You could just add a new endpoint like users' comments.
It's exactly. You're thinking ahead, future-proofing your API design. And speaking of future-proofing, we've got to talk about versioning. As your API grows and changes, you don't want to break things for people who are already using it, right?
Versioning is key. It's like a safety net. A simple way to do it is just add version numbers right into your URLs.
Like V1 or V2.
That way, developers can choose which version they want to work with. Ensures compatibility and smooth transitions as your API evolves.
It's like choosing which edition of a textbook you want to use, right?
Yeah.
You can stick with the older one if you're comfortable with it, or you can jump to the latest and greatest. Now, before we move on to that awesome list of DevOps resources, there are two more API design gems I want to touch on, pagination and filtering.
Yes. These are essential when you're dealing with large data sets.
Right. Imagine you're browsing like an online store with thousands of products.
You wouldn't want to load everything all at once. It would take forever.
Exactly. Pagination is like breaking that massive catalog into smaller, more manageable pages.
Easier to digest, and then on top of that, you have filtering.
So if you're looking for something specific, like let's say shoes in size 10, blue, and under $100.
Filtering lets you pinpoint exactly what you need, makes the retrieval process so much faster.
So pagination is about making large data sets less daunting. And filtering helps users quickly find what they're looking for.
You got it. And it's not just about the technical details. It's about the user experience. No one wants to wait around forever or sift through irrelevant information.
Okay, so we've covered some foundational API design principles. Now let's shift gears a bit and explore those YouTube channels on DevOps. I'm particularly interested in the security resources.
Security is absolutely crucial, especially for APIs that handle sensitive data. Let's see. The source recommends FreeCodeCamp
For their comprehensive and beginner-friendly approach.
That's right. Then there's Adorica, which offers more detailed tutorials and demos. And finally, CloudChamp, if you're looking for a focus specifically on cloud security.
So it's like having a personalized security briefing. What about version control and CI/CD? They came up quite a bit.
These are essential for managing code changes, automating testing, and streamlining deployments. Let's see. For a good introduction to Git, Abhishek Viramala is recommended.
Git being a popular version control system.
Right. Then there's Tech World with Nana. They give a nice overview of CI/CD concepts and tools like Jenkins.
Okay, and if you want a more structured learning path, there's always Simply Learn, which offers in-depth courses, often with certifications.
Yeah, great resource.
So plenty of options depending on how deep you want to dive. Now, what about containerization with Docker? That seems like a pretty big deal these days.
Huge. It's all about packaging your API and its dependencies into a neat, portable container so it can run consistently across different environments.
Like putting your API in a travel-ready suitcase.
Exactly. For a fun and quick intro to Docker, Fireship is a good choice. And if you want to go deeper into containerization concepts and best practices, DevOps Directive is excellent.
Awesome. So you've got your API all packed up in its container. Now, what about the infrastructure it runs on? I've heard the term infrastructure as code, or IAC.
Yeah, with IAC, you manage your infrastructure using code, just like you manage your application code. Servers, networks, all of that. It makes deployments much more predictable, repeatable, and scalable.
So you're basically writing a script that describes how you want everything set up.
You got it. It's like a blueprint for your infrastructure.
Oh.
Both DevOps Directive and Simply Learn are good resources for learning IAC, by the way. They can guide you through various tools and platforms.
Perfect. Okay, let's talk cloud. AWS, Azure, GCP, they're everywhere. It's like they're these giant playgrounds for deploying applications.
They are. They offer such a wide range of services. It can be a bit overwhelming at first, for sure.
So it's like choosing a toolkit based on what you're building.
Exactly. You wouldn't use a hammer to screw in a light bulb. For getting started with these platforms, Tech World with Nana provides a good general overview. Then, if you want to dig deeper into specific cloud services, there's ThinkInspire.
Great recommendations. Last but not least, what about networking basics? It's not something that immediately comes to mind when we think about APIs.
True, but understanding how data flows between your API, its users, and different parts of your infrastructure is crucial for performance, security, and troubleshooting. You don't want to neglect it.
It's all connected.
It is. For a clear introduction to networking concepts, CloudChamp is a good place to start. And to explore more advanced networking topics, check out Abhishek Viramala. He goes pretty deep.
Wow, we've covered a lot. Best practices for designing user-friendly APIs, plus a ton of resources for diving into DevOps and cloud technologies.
It's like we've given you a recipe and a whole pantry full of ingredients. Now it's your turn to cook up something amazing.
I like that analogy. Before we move on to part two, I want to leave you with something to ponder. Think about all the things we've discussed. API design, tools, technologies. What kind of API would you create to solve a problem that you're passionate about? Something to think about. We'll be back soon to explore some of these concepts in even more detail. Welcome back. It's amazing how many different layers there are to building an API. To the end user, it might just seem like this simple interaction with an app, but behind the scenes, there's this whole intricate world of tools and technologies all working together.
Yeah, it really is like an orchestra. Every instrument has its role to play in creating that seamless experience.
And speaking of roles, one thing that really struck me about those YouTube channels was the emphasis on continuous learning in the DevOps space. It's not just about learning the basics and then you're good to go, right? It seems like you have to constantly keep up with new technologies and methodologies.
Oh, absolutely. The DevOps landscape is constantly changing, which is why those YouTube channels are such a valuable resource. They give you this direct line to the experts who are shaping the future of software development.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit and zoom in on one of the core concepts we touched on earlier, version control,
Right.
specifically using Git. Now, as a user, I rarely think about version control, but I imagine for developers working together on a project, it's absolutely crucial.
It is. Git allows developers to track changes, experiment with new features, and collaborate without, stepping on each other's toes. Imagine trying to edit a shared document with 10 people at the same time.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Exactly, pure chaos. But Git prevents that chaos by letting each developer work on their own copy of the code and then merge those changes back into the main project in a controlled way.
So it's like having a time machine for your code, right? You can go back to previous versions, compare changes, even undo mistakes.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that Git's not just for code. You can use it to track changes to any type of file. Super versatile for all kinds of projects.
Now, the source mentioned that once you've got a good grasp of Git, you can start exploring CI/CD pipelines. Can you explain how CI/CD sort of takes version control to the next level?
Well, think of CI/CD as automating the process of getting your code from your computer to your users. It involves building your application, testing it thoroughly, and then deploying it to a server where users can access it. And CI/CD pipelines automate all of these steps. So it saves developers a ton of time, reduces the risk of errors.
So instead of manually running all those steps every time you make a change, you set up a system that does it for you automatically.
Exactly. It's a game changer. And when you combine CI/CD with containerization using Docker, you create an even more powerful workflow.
Because Docker makes sure your application runs consistently across different environments, right?
Exactly. And then CI/CD automates the process of building and deploying those containers. It's like a well-oiled machine.
So you've got your API packaged neatly in a container. You've got this automated pipeline that builds, tests, and deploys it. But what about the infrastructure it all runs on? That's where infrastructure as code comes in.
Exactly. With infrastructure as code, or IAC, you use code to define and manage your infrastructure. Things like servers, networks, databases. Makes it much easier to create, modify, and replicate your infrastructure. And it eliminates a lot of the potential for human error that comes with manual configuration.
So instead of like clicking around at a web console, you're writing a script that describes exactly how you want your infrastructure to be set up.
Precisely, and it brings a lot of consistency and repeatability to the process.
Okay, so now let's talk about actually deploying your API. Our source mentioned those cloud platforms like AWS, Azure, and GCP. And these platforms, they seem to offer just this dizzying array of services. It could be a bit overwhelming.
It can be. It's like walking into a giant supermarket with aisles and aisles of choices. But instead of groceries, you're choosing databases, servers, load balancers, and all these other cloud services. The key is to understand your API's specific requirements and choose the services that best meet those needs. And don't be afraid to experiment. A lot of cloud platforms offer free tiers or trial periods, so you can play around with different services and see what works best for you.
So it's really like having a playground for your cloud experiment.
Yeah.
But with so many options, how do you even know where to begin?
Well, that's where those YouTube channels we talked about earlier can be really helpful. They provide a good overview of different platforms and services and can help you figure out which tools might be the best fit for your project.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about security. We touched on this earlier, but I think it's worth emphasizing again, especially in the context of cloud deployments. With your API out there in the cloud, how do you make sure that it's protected?
Security is absolutely paramount, especially when you're dealing with APIs that handle sensitive information. And it's not something you just tack on at the end. It needs to be baked into every single stage of the development and deployment process.
So what are some of the key things developers should keep in mind when it comes to securing their APIs?
Well, you want to start with strong authentication and authorization mechanisms. These control who can access your API and what they can do with it.
So it's like having a really good bouncer at the door of your API, right? Checking IDs and only letting in those who have the right credentials.
Exactly. But then you also want to make sure you're protecting against common attacks like injection attacks, cross-site scripting, denial of service attacks.
So there's a whole arsenal of security measures to think about. It sounds like a pretty complex and ever-evolving challenge.
It is, but thankfully, there are a lot of resources out there to help developers secure their APIs effectively. Organizations like OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, provide comprehensive guides and resources, and there's a wealth of information available on blogs, forums, online communities dedicated to web application security.
It's like having a network of security experts at your fingertips.
That's right. And really, it comes down to staying vigilant, staying informed, and constantly adapting your security measures to stay ahead of the curve.
So security is not a one-time fix. It's a continuous process.
Exactly. And by integrating security into your development workflow from the very beginning, you can build APIs that are not only powerful and efficient, but also secure and trustworthy. Which brings us back to our initial goal, right? Creating APIs that empower developers to build amazing applications while also protecting users and their data.
Absolutely. And with all the cloud services and tools available today, it feels like we're entering this golden age of API development. It's a really exciting time to be a developer.
I completely agree. There's so much potential out there.
Speaking of powerful tools, are you ready to delve into some of the specific cloud services that developers can use to bring their API dreams to life? We've got AWS, Azure, GCP, a whole smorgasbord of cloud goodness to explore.
Absolutely. Let's crack open that cloud buffet and see what delicious services we can find.
Okay, so we're back, and we're finally ready to dive into those specific cloud services that can help you build and deploy these awesome APIs. It's like, we've talked about the blueprints, we've talked about the construction crew, and now we're actually getting down to the building materials.
Exactly. We've covered the foundation, the principles, the workflow, and now it's time to actually explore the components that make it all happen.
So where do we start? What are some of those essential building blocks for an API in the cloud?
Well, first things first, you need somewhere to store all that data that your API is going to be handling, right?
Sure.
That's where cloud databases come in. And the great thing is you've got options.
Options are always good.
Right. You've got your relational databases like MySQL and PostgreSQL, great for structured data.
Yeah, those are the classic ones.
Then you've got your NoSQL databases like MongoDB or Cassandra if you're dealing with massive amounts of data that's less structured.
So it's like choosing the right storage container for your stuff. You wouldn't keep your valuable china in a cardboard box, right? You'd want something sturdy and secure.
Exactly. And in the cloud, you have these super secure, reliable, and scalable databases that can handle tons of data and traffic. Plus, you don't have to worry about the maintenance and management. The cloud provider takes care of all that for you.
Which is a huge plus. Okay, so we've got our data storage figured out. Now, how do we actually make sure our API can talk to the outside world? I'm guessing that's where cloud networking services come into play.
You got it. Things like virtual private clouds, VPCs, load balancers, API gateways.
Lots of acronyms.
Right. But they're not as intimidating as they sound. VPCs, they let you create these isolated networks within the cloud. Gives you more control over security and connectivity.
Makes
Load balancers, they distribute traffic across multiple servers so your API can handle those busy periods without slowing down.
So it's like having a traffic cop directing all the incoming requests.
Exactly. And then you have API gateways. They act as the central entry point for all your API requests. Makes it easier to manage things like authentication, authorization, rate limiting.
So it's like having a sophisticated traffic management system for your API, making sure everything flows smoothly and efficiently, even when things get really busy.
Exactly. And, if your API starts handling a lot of global traffic, you might even consider using a content delivery network, a CDN.
Ah, CDNs. I've heard of those. They help speed things up, right?
Yeah, they cache your API's responses in multiple locations around the world, reduces latency, and improves the experience for users no matter where they are.
So it's like having a network of couriers standing by, ready to deliver your API's responses in a flash. But, with all these amazing cloud services and all this flexibility, doesn't that also introduce new security challenges? It seems like there's a lot to think about.
Absolutely. Security is even more critical in the cloud environment. You can't just rely on the built-in security features that the cloud platform provides. You have to be proactive.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, it means using strong authentication and authorization mechanisms, making sure you're validating inputs, encoding outputs, being very aware of common web application vulnerabilities. You have to build layers of defense.
Like building a fortress around your API.
Exactly. And one of the best ways to strengthen those defenses is by adopting what's called a DevSecOps approach. It's basically integrating security practices into every single stage of development, from the initial planning and design all the way to testing and deployment.
So it's not an afterthought. It's baked into the process from the very beginning.
Exactly. Security becomes part of the DNA of your development process. And by doing so, you build APIs that are not only powerful and efficient, but also secure and trustworthy, which brings us back to that initial goal we talked about, creating APIs that empower developers to build amazing things, but also protect users and their data. It's a balancing act, but it's so important to get it right. And, with all the cloud services and tools that are available these days, it really does feel like we're entering this golden age of API development. It's such an exciting time to be a developer.
I completely agree. There's so much potential for innovation.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, continuous learning. With cloud technologies evolving so rapidly, how can developers stay on top of things and keep their skills sharp?
Well, those resources we've been talking about throughout this deep dive, those YouTube channels, those online communities, the documentation from the cloud providers, those are your lifeline. They're constantly being updated with the latest trends, the best practices, and the new tools that are emerging in the cloud landscape. It's like having a personalized, always updated textbook at your fingertips.
So it's about staying curious, embracing that learning process, realizing that in this field, there's always something new to discover.
Absolutely. Never stop exploring, experimenting, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with APIs and the cloud. So well said. And on that note, I think it's time to bring this deep dive to a close. We started with those fundamental API design principles. We've gone through the intricacies of cloud deployment, and we've explored a whole world of possibilities along the way. I hope you enjoyed the journey.
It's been a pleasure sharing this journey with you. And remember, the best way to learn is by doing. Go out there, experiment, build something amazing, and never stop exploring the incredible power of APIs and the cloud.
Until next time, happy coding.